With your boxes, you want to avoid divergence happening here. So notice how as your box goes back into space, your lines diverge a bit, so they point outwards. You want them at a minimum to be pointing parallel to each other. This is called isometric. And when they're pointing towards each other, this is called divergence. Sorry, convergence. This is called convergence. When they're pointing away from each other, that is divergence. This you never want. This is the minimum, and this is great. Lots of the boxes that I've been doing are a mix between isometric boxes and converging boxes. But you can see that I'm not focusing too much on the convergence because the only goal here is rotating them with the context of the surrounding boxes. You can look at one edge and rotate the box on that axis. Same here, I'm rotating all the boxes on kind of one pole that goes right down the middle. The convergence and the 3-point, the 5-point, 6-point perspective, that comes in only once we get into week 3. So primitive forms in the same space. If you look at the example on the PDF document that I uploaded, you see that that's when we really start to consider all of the boxes looking like they really share the same space. We're kind of doing that here, but we don't care so much about the grounding of the boxes. We don't consider gravity too much. We only look at rotating them and trying to be more free in placing them randomly. Or I should say with more intention. And then week 5 is when we really start to put them together to construct figures and animals with primitive forms. I'll show you guys a quick trick for that, just so you can see how this will start to apply. But we do more of this in week 3. Drawing a figure, let's say. You can just imagine the figure as a primitive form. So you can think of shoulders, hips, knees, ankles. Once you have this down, you just make sure that proportions are right. And notice how the only thing I was considering here is having all of my guidelines pointing to a vanishing point. What this does is it solidifies it in perspective. And we have possibilities for vertices to appear once we connect the edges. Again, I don't really want these to diverge too much. I'm going to keep my connecting lines parallel because they're not lines that are meant to show depth. The lines that are meant to show depth are the ones going back in space. These ones are just meant to kind of outline the plane that I'm drawing. So now, once I have this is a pretty solid plane in perspective. What I have to consider now is adding depth to this and more volume, I would say. Because right now we just have a plane folded up a bunch. So this is the exercise for week 4. So primitive forms drawn using guidelines in perspective. The guidelines in perspective are these right here. Those are showing depth. So adding to those, I can close my eyes and draw a random line. Doesn't matter, as long as I connect it. This form, like our eyes automatically assume that whatever edge is created here goes back into space because it's not defined. But if you define it incorrectly, then it's going to look awkward. These right here, these lines here, they represent something completely different. They represent value as well as form. Every time I say a word like value or form, you have to take it and classify it under that fundamental. When we move to lines and form, you have to consider that vocabulary. It's very important to remember the vocabulary. Value would be stuff like black, gray, light gray, and white. Right here, we're just using lines to represent value. Representing value as opposed to representing an outline of a form. Or using lines to represent depth and perspective. Right here, I'm using value lines to represent the pigment and saturation in the gums. And then here, I'm using an outline to represent the outline and the form of the nose. Here, I'm using another value line to represent the darkness found in the eye. And I could use another value line to represent the darkness in the eyebrow. Form just means I'm defining the way that the form takes up 3D space. So I'm outlining the wireframe. If you've ever seen in 3D like the Asara head, you see it's composed of a bunch of straight edges. That's the wireframe of the face. These wireframes here define the face in a very simple fashion, and it's very, very geometric, right? So outlines represent the exterior of the shape, and then contour lines represent the volume of the form. And notice this is not related to form or contour or value, but the speed which I use my lines changes depending on how I'm thinking of them. So quick lines, they go from lots of pressure to low pressure. Lots of pressure to low pressure. That's what gives it the smooth feeling or effect. With slow lines, I like to start it kind of, just relaxed and then end it very heavy. And this all comes from traditional art. I like to use pencils very quickly and I use pens very slowly. And what happens is, even with markers, you end up seeing an ink blot at the end of the stroke. So that's why I tend to lean towards that. You don't have to consider that when you're drawing, but it's just an extra piece of information. So saturation is how much pigment a color has. Color is very ambiguous. It just represents any point on this graph is a color. But the saturation of a color brings the color from left to right. So we can go with many examples. This could be desaturated versus saturated, desaturated versus saturated. The same thing works when you are changing the value. So that could also be where the discussion is getting its ideas from. So when I go from black to red, there's a very obvious increase in value as well as saturation. I go from black to red to a very saturated red. How gray can a color get? As gray as you want it to be. As soon as you move it all the way to gray, it'll become gray. Though it's important to notice that when you increase the saturation in a color, you're also decreasing its value at the same time. So notice how all of these colors here, they were left at the top of my color wheel, and I just dragged the color picker to the right without changing the brightness. I kept it all the way at the top. I kept it as bright as I could. If we just decrease the saturation, we can see that the more saturated I went, the more the value decreased. And the opposite happens when you go from black to a full saturated red. When I go from black to red, it increases in value. So it really depends on where you're starting, and there's probably some gray zone in here where it just stays the same value as you go from gray to red, but you would have to calculate it's an arc, it's not a linear trajectory, I think. Like now the more I go up, it's just gonna get brighter and brighter. If we check the values here, you can see I was able to keep it pretty much the same value. There's my take on value versus saturation. So I find value lines they're very useful and they're quite underrated. I mean, people don't make the distinction between contour lines, silhouette lines, value lines, because the conversation doesn't pop up much, but if it did, I think it would help people with utilizing them. And there's so many different ways you can combine them. I can completely ignore value and I can consider all this dark, but I know that when you have something so dark, you have no information. So I can just use a silhouette line to represent the value line. So I'm going for value lines with a outline approach.
Is there a way that you get the proportions just right? Is there a certain way of thinking when it comes to that, or is it all just practice?
Yeah, so when it comes to visual coordinations, that's what you mean by getting the proportions right. It really is mileage, because it's a skill that you can only train by getting more precise when you do copy images. You can make your measurements like this, try to copy, using a grid or using horizontal and vertical lines to help your measurements be in the right spot. That's a very technical approach. A step up from that would be just simplifying your organic shapes that you see in the reference to more hard-edged shapes. When you're trying to copy an image one-to-one, just make sure that your bigger shapes are correct first, and then you move to the smaller shapes. So that's the more technical approach. But other than that, it is just practice and experience. If I were copying this image, I would look at the shape of his head rather than the shape of his nose or his eye or the shape of the shadow casted by his brow. So I'm just looking at copying the general proportions of that shape, the same way I would when I would be painting. Next up, I would, just try to build up more information from this. I don't have much shown right here, so I can try to find the next biggest shape. And so right now I've grouped up his head with his neck. So I think just making a distinction where the chin starts would be a good anchor point, I think. And then measuring where the center of his face is, mark the eye line. I'm doing these very quickly, but for those that have a hard time with this, you should really spend, like I tell my students this, spend 10 minutes on this stage. If I spend lots of time just getting these major shapes down, it's gonna do me a huge favor when it comes to the later stages of the drawing. Blocking out the big shape of the hair. Where does the hair start? And now the distance between the hairline and the brow is quite big here, and I made it too small. All I do is I lower it a bit. It's a big shape, right? So I have to take the time to correct it. I can carve out the shape of the ear. Now, what I did before was I grouped up the shape so that it was very simple, but I've neglected some of the positive shapes that appear right here. So now I'm going to carve those back in. And that's something that I didn't say as I was doing it, but I did that in my head. So it's important to consider, are you including the negative shapes or are you excluding them? And same thing for positive shapes. You can see right here, I've ignored this negative shape. Like when the time comes, I'm going to tackle that shape. I'm not looking at it right now because it's so small. So I want to make sure my big shapes are correct first. Aside from just capturing the shapes of the features, you can also look at shapes of value. So now I'm going to look at this shape right here and try to represent them using value lines. Now, of course, the lines I was using for the face, I don't know what you would call them because they're not really, I guess they are outlines, but they're more measurement lines. You can consider it like that. They're just measurement lines. Just trying to hold something in place without representing too much of the form. And I wouldn't even have to outline the shape of the eye because it's not even present in the image. It's like as if I were to try to outline this distinction between this dark value here and this slightly lighter one. It's the same thing. There's a dark value here and there's something slightly brighter. If the differences are subtle, you should not care about them. And so now I'm considering that smaller shape. I'm going to be looking at emulating some of that texture found in the hair. So this is how I would go about copying the proportions in an image. Of course, if I was going for shape design, I would approach this completely differently. I would look for strong shapes. I would look for the biggest shapes first, then move my way down to smaller shapes. If I was approaching it with a value line lens, I would probably start blocking in big shapes of value before other proportions. But I think that process is quite similar to this.
And those different methods of like recreating an image, those are all just different ways of practicing to get better at just generally copying an image.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just image copying at that point, with the goal to just get better at making observations and accurate measurements, which helps you a ton when it comes to studying. It helps you when you're looking at your cylinders. It helps you notice when the angle is not 90 degrees. Helps you notice when a cylinder is not perfectly symmetrical. Helps you with a lot of stuff. Just really specific measurements. Common mistake I see when it comes to cylinders is, first of all, making this backline flat. The curve degree should always be rounder than the one in the front. So I'm always making this one a lot rounder. The second thing I see is you have your curve degree placed like that. You have to consider the direction of the cylinder. Sometimes I see people drawing the cylinder something like this, which is not totally incorrect. It's just that the direction is a bit off. So you can see that it's pointing from here down here. What you want to look for is, where is it pointing towards? Notice how my major axis spans from here to down here. This one is from here to here. So this cylinder is pointing up, whereas this cylinder is pointing like perfectly horizontally. What I'm looking for is making sure that I find that direction and then converge my connecting lines towards the vanishing point and have the second curve degree on the same angle, not having it like this. I'm having it perfectly vertical. That doesn't matter what rotation it's at as long as the direction is consistent throughout. Partly visual coordination, being able to recognize that detail.